We're going to start now with the first of the three presentations. Our first lecturer is somebody who I think is known to most in this room, Bradley Wilson, who is a senior lecturer of Japanese, the leader of our faculty directed program at Hiroshima. The title of this talk today, The God of Manga, or Japan's Walt Disney. Are we squared away? We're afraid to touch anything.
I know, I'm afraid to touch anything for fear that it will break all the online connection. Oh my. There's also a trap door right here, which makes me very nervous. That fix anything? All right. I can't tell. Can the people on Zoom hear and see? Can anybody tell?
It doesn't look like you're sharing the screen, probably not.
It should be coming through the camera one, because I can see myself here. Yeah, I'm going to take my mask off. So this is very good timing because one of our quiz questions here was just about Tezuka. You know, I'm very jealous of most of the people in this room because growing up in the 90s, we certainly did not have at all the access to anything Japanese popular culture related like you guys have nowadays. And I'm talking about how we would go to the comic book store, which I don't know if we even have those anymore. And I would walk in, you'd have to make eyes with the guy behind the counter, right? And then he'd give you a nod and you'd go, "You got the stuff?" And then he'd go, "You got the stuff?" And you'd slide some money on the counter and he'd slide an unmarked VHS tape over and you just kind of put it in your pocket and walk out. And that's how we got access to animated stuff before it became commercially available. And I'm talking about, it was probably unsubtitled episodes of Sailor Moon and commercials for constipation medicine. But of course, it was just exotic and unique and different from what we had been exposed to up until that point. So I'm really happy now we have so much quick access to popular culture materials from Japan. But we have to wonder, how did it get this prolific, right? Japan is a particularly unique country in that its popular culture materials have spread across the world and have had tremendous influence. And a lot of that origin comes from this guy, Osamu Tezuka. So I'd like to talk about him today. And I'm also wearing his t-shirt, so his foundation does not pay me, but he has had quite an effect. Uh-oh, okay. It's okay. Okay, we're not moving, there's no slide. All right, thank you. So Tezuka was born in Osaka, but very quickly after being born in Osaka, moved to a town called Takarazuka. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because it's the location of the esteemed Takarazuka Review, which, if you've never seen one of those, is an extremely flowery, romantic, amazing musical that is staffed with entirely female actors in every role, which you might guess is kind of unique in Japan. And as a young child, Tezuka's family loved the arts and took him constantly to places so that he could experience not only things like Takarazuka, but film. His father also loved comic books too, and so they were always around the house. So all around Tezuka were these creative materials. And although he was the oldest of his three siblings, he was really small and really frail and actually bullied a bit at school. He was not popular at all. And that turned around for him when he discovered that he had a real knack for drawing their teachers as comic characters and making fun of them. So once he started showing his classmates that he could really create funny things, they started to hang out with him, play with him, and he became much more popular. But that didn't stop him from pursuing all of his interests. Not only was he interested in art, but he was also interested in nature quite a bit, particularly in insects. And so he would go off into the mountains and search for insects, and he really liked beetles. And there's one beetle called the Osamushi, and he was so struck by the beauty of this beetle that he decided to add that character for insect to his real name, Tezuka Osamu, in order to make his pen name. One more time. All right. Okay. So that on the left of there, that's his real birth name. On the right there is his pen name. You see it looks the same, but it's a really call out there to that beetle that he enjoyed so much. And this love of nature really persisted beyond throughout his whole life, because a lot of the works he worked on later have a strong basis of environmentalism and preservation of nature and things like that. Tezuka grew up in a time when we were unfortunately in the midst of war, and at age 16, World War II was raging around him, and like many boys his age, he was conscripted into the war effort as a teenage mobilized worker, and he was made to work in a factory, which was not uncommon at this time. If you've ever seen the movie Grave of the Fireflies, the main character there, Seita, he is supposed to also be a mobilized worker, although we see in that film he doesn't kind of keep up with that. But Tezuka could not let go of drawing, and he constantly drew. And you may wonder, why do I have toilet paper up here? Because he wasn't supposed to be wasting time on frivolous things like drawing. And so he kept doing drawing in the toilet on toilet paper, so he could easily flush it away in case he got caught. And his compatriots really liked his drawings. They thought it was really funny, but his superiors hated his drawings and frequently beat him for doing it. Yet it was one of his ways of coping with the war raging around him. And although his town was burned down and although many people around him perished, he survived. And part of that mentally was his continual drawing and pursuing the arts. And because of his time in the war, again, it affected his works from there on out. And he continued to examine mankind's capacity for destruction and violence, which shows up in some of his later works. But he wasn't always going to be an artist. Art was his passion, but what he wanted to do was have a respectable job, because at the time, comic books were considered fluff and actually somewhat dangerous because it could make your kids dumber. So he went into medicine. He was accepted into the School of Medicine in Osaka University in 1945 and continued at the same time to pursue medicine and art, although art was his hobby and medicine was going to be his career. But he didn't stop drawing, never stopped drawing, kept doing it. And indeed, at the insistence of a friend, he submitted some of his work to a subsidiary of the Mainichi Shimbun, one of the major newspapers in Japan, and he was awarded his first professional publication, which was the Diary of Machan in 1946, which was a kind of a traditional yonkoma or four-panel gag comic. And you can see here, it's extremely bare compared to a lot of Tezuka's later stuff. But this drew attention. And Tezuka went on to be scouted by a local artist named Shishima Sakai, who was doing a concept of New Treasure Island. And he wanted Tezuka to draw it for him, which he did do. And Tezuka was so excited to do this that he drew over 250 pages of work, which then Shishima Sakai had to cut down to like 170 and change the story completely. But that did not discourage Tezuka, because this was his break. And with that behind him, he thought, I am going to Tokyo. I'm going to get a big job, and I'm going to bring my art to the people. They all turned him down. So he cruised Tokyo, applied to all the major publishers, and they all said no. Until he was asked to do a small serialization in Manga Shonen by Gakudosha Publication Company, a smaller publication company at the time. And what he wrote for that was Jungle Emperor, which we know in English as Kimba the White Lion. And this gave him the notoriety to be noticed by Tokyo. And on a side note, if you've ever seen The Lion King, there are some distressing similarities between the characters and the storyline of this and The Lion King, but that is a story for another day. His success continued to snowball once he was allowed to work through Tokyo publishers. So he created Jungle Emperor, which snowballed into something called Ambassador Adam, which a spin-off character from that turned into probably one of his greatest and most recognizable characters, Astro Boy, or Tetsuan Atomu. He's here on my shirt. He's the biggest one on the shirt too there. And Astro Boy would go on to be serialized for quite a long time. And it's actually quite unique, especially if we consider its compatriots at the time in American publications. You didn't see negative things happen. You always saw superhero kind of things, right, in America. But here, the very first episode of Astro Boy, the child dies in a car accident, and you see his father carry his corpse out. You'd never see that early on in America, but we were already examining more adult themes, even in the 1960s of Japan. And this snowballed and snowballed and snowballed and snowballed until Tezuka became the #1 comic artist in Japan. And it wasn't for lack of effort. He worked so hard and for so many different publishers that sometimes publishers would have to follow him around physically and beg him to draw the pages for that week's publication because he was so behind. And he became notorious for this kind of work lifestyle. In fact, he'd have to have secret safe houses where he went to work privately so that nobody could find him, so he could work in peace. And inspired by Walt Disney, who at the time was already at the forefront of American animation. In 1937, we saw the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Tezuka saw that and wanted to bring that to Japan in a way. And how could he do that? Well, by adapting his own material. He was so impressed by this film, he could not get it out of his mind. So after he got married, he opened up his own production studio called Mushi Productions or Insect Productions. And through that studio, they made Astro Boy on TV, which was the first animated serialized television show in Japan ever. And this drew even more attention. People started outside of Japan recognizing Tezuka as this important force. And at the New York World's Fair, Tezuka had a chance to meet Walt Disney in person. And Walt Disney, and he was gushing over Walt Disney, right? This is his idol. Walt Disney sees Tezuka and goes, I love that Astro Boy. I've got to do something like that for America. All of a sudden, the tables are reversed, and Tezuka is now the peer being admired. Similarly, Stanley Kubrick, who directed 2001: Space Odyssey, called Tezuka and wanted him to be his visual set director, which Tezuka could not do because he couldn't be away from his own studio. But over time, Tezuka's star started to fade, and he started moving on to less children-focused works, which were kind of the majority of what he'd been doing up until then, into more adult works. So he was exploring the sex and greed and things like that, which kind of turned some people off and weren't as popular. So by the early 1970s, he was kind of looked at as on his way out. And Akita Shoten, which is a publisher, went to him and they kind of felt sorry because there was this great man who had done so much. And they went to him and said, we'll do a commemorative work for you. You can do whatever story you want, and it'll be kind of like your last hurrah. And Tezuka agreed. And what he made was Blackjack, which ended up being serialized for 10 years. And it just catapulted him back again into stardom and kind of the center of Japanese comic publishing. All the while Tezuka is working on his own works, he is also helping educate other up-and-coming artists. He had a whole apartment complex that he lived in where other artists would go move there and kind of get the creative juices flowing within them. He was constantly working with new people, even people that showed up on his doorstep, just begging for him to look at their stuff. He would sometimes have conversations with them for hours about what they could do. So he was a tireless worker that really promoted not only his own works, which were incredibly important, but also the works of other people, allowing anime to grow bigger and bigger as an industry in Japan. Sadly, though, later on, he started to have stomach problems, and he knew that it was affecting him physically. He was once renowned for being able to draw a perfect circle without any aid. And they were making a documentary of him, and on the documentary, he could no longer make the circle as perfect. And that was kind of this sign to him that something's happening. Well, unfortunately, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and just after turning 60, he passed away in 1989. And he was still working nearly up to his deathbed. People were still trying to get him to draw pages and submit pages for publication. And his last thing he was working on was a fictionalized story about the life of Beethoven, but he couldn't quite get it done. After a lifetime of comic drawing, and indeed he created over 700 different stories and drew personally over 700,000 pages of comics, the shining star that was Tezuka passed away. He was surrounded by his family at the time, and his last words were, "I'm begging you, please let me work." Sometimes Tezuka is called the Walt Disney of Japan, but I actually don't like that because that puts him in a subordinate position to Disney. And indeed we see, and indeed Disney acknowledged, Tezuka was a compatriot and a peer. So I much more prefer the name, the God of Manga, which has been applied to him, because he really was not the creator of all manga, but one of the integral figures in allowing manga and especially anime to flourish in Japan and then thus flourish abroad. There in the center, we see Tezuka's, what we consider his lifelong work, Hinotori, or the Phoenix, which is a series of disconnected stories that takes place throughout different ages of Japanese history. And I think kind of like the Phoenix, Tezuka kind of had these lows and these rebirths throughout his career. And even though he is passed, the influence of his work is still very present. And so that Phoenix is still flying, and I really want to see where it's going to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Robert Tuck.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Also, thank you to Car for giving me the opportunity to talk here today. So my name is Robert Tuck. I am Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Literature and Culture. And my talk today is entitled very simply, Warrior Cultures in Manga and Anime. Now, when I mention warrior cultures in a Japanese context, most of you probably don't have too much hard work to do to figure out that what I'm talking about is primarily samurai and ninja, okay? And these are, I think, two of arguably the most recognizable cultural icons of Japan in popular culture. The third, of course, would be the geisha. That was supposed to fly in from the right, but clearly my version of PowerPoint didn't quite transfer here. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the geisha here today, but if you are at all interested in exploring any of these three cultural icons, the samurai, the geisha, and the ninja, at ASU, you're in luck, because in fall of 2022, I will actually be teaching two courses. The first of them, Samurai and Geisha. The second one, The Art of the Ninja. That's actually a course I'm teaching right now. I know some of you here today are in that, which will allow you to explore all three of these cultural icons to your heart's content. We'll look at their place in popular culture, what kind of historical evidence we can find about these figures, and so on and so forth. And I should say at this point, by the way, absolutely no Japanese language is required for any of these courses. You can take them regardless of your level of Japanese ability or none whatsoever, okay? All right, so let me see. Would it help if I press F5? Does that work? Because you can, so I can see, there we go. Nope. Okay. All right, I think I'm just going to stick with what we have on the screen right now. Is that okay? Does that work? Okay. There we go. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned today, my main focus is basically on these two warrior figures, the samurai and the ninja, not the click to add title in the background, which wasn't there when I was displaying this. Is it possible to cause this to display properly, or are we stuck with the? Okay. Let's see. Because I know I think the viewers are seeing what's on the. Just what's on the screen rather than it should be with the slideshow. Is that better? Yep, will that work better? Okay, all right, we'll go with that then. So, all right, you know about samurai and you probably know about ninja, right? We know the samurai as the noble, aristocratic, and above all, honorable warrior figure. And we also know the ninja as the low-down, sneaky, underhand assassin figure, right? We're familiar with, I think, that particular image in popular culture. You probably also encountered the idea that the samurai and the ninja basically hate each other's guts, right? That their values are so sort of fundamentally opposed to each other that they are sort of two antagonistic forces. What's interesting about this particular idea is that it's not true. The idea of ninja and samurai as antithesis from one another can't really be supported by anything much in the historical record. And in fact, the idea of ninja and samurai as opposed to one another doesn't really show up in Japanese popular culture until as late as 1962, with one particular ninja movie we've actually been watching in my course this semester. But I think this particular example, the idea that the ninja and samurai are two sort of mutually opposed forces, is kind of an excellent example of what I'm going to be talking about today, namely that popular culture, and today I'm mostly talking about manga and anime, can work to create what are essentially alternative histories. They can almost create their own parallel popular history in a way that we don't always realize, certainly in ways that have little or nothing to do with what we would think of as rigorous historical scholarship. So I want to talk today about two specific works, or two specific, I guess, ranges of works featuring samurai and ninja. The first of these is the manga and later anime Rurouni Kenshin. Anybody familiar with this? Yeah, okay, so I'm seeing some fans in the audience right now. So Rurouni Kenshin was predominantly, I think, the late 1990s. The second work I want to talk about is mostly ninja manga by the artist Shirato Sanpei during the 1960s and early 1970s. And probably, I think the main point that I want to make today is that with these two popular works, we can see something that we might perhaps call the truth effect when we are looking at works that have an historical setting. In other words, when you have a story that features a lot of stuff that really did happen, it's quite easy for fictional elements within that story to kind of be swept along in the flow and to find themselves entering popular culture as also historical truth as well. Or to put it another way, when we look at an anime or a manga or really historical fiction or a movie with a historical setting, quite often the background events did basically happen, right? But the details of the action probably did not. But it's not that uncommon, I would argue, for both of these, for both fact and fiction, to end up getting blurred together within the realm of popular culture and cultural memory here. Now, this is very much the case with Rurouni Kenshin. It's quite a long sort of overall story arc, but it basically begins in the 1850s and 1860s in Japan, which was an extremely turbulent and violent period. It was basically a country teetering on the edge of outright civil war between pro-imperial and pro-Tokugawa factions. The Tokugawa was basically the ruling samurai dynasty of Japan at that point, had ruled for about 250 years. But increasingly, there was a series of domains that were determined to overthrow the Tokugawa. In 1868, they basically succeeded. But the run-up to that was not pretty. We see in Rurouni Kenshin, and as happened in the real world, a lot of bloody killings. It was not uncommon for people to be murdered for various forms of siding with political factions, strung up from bridges, cut down and left to die in the street, so on and so forth. And if you're familiar with Rurouni Kenshin, this is one of the more restrained images I could have shown here, okay? There's some pretty bloody combat happening throughout much of the universe here. And many of the killings, and here I'm actually mostly talking about one of the early arc here, are carried out by the character we see on the left, Himura Kenshin, who is a highly skilled samurai of the Choshu domain in Western Japan. Now, the Choshu domain really did exist. It was one of the domains instrumental in overthrowing the Tokugawa. And along those lines, throughout Rurouni Kenshin, or here particularly the OWA, that is Samurai X Trust and Betrayal, which is where I'm taking these images from, real events are repeatedly alluded to. We have essentially a narration of real history going on in the background. Again, the details perhaps here are less important than the claim to grounding what's happening within a historical context. Other examples include references, for instance, to real historical figures. Yoshida Shoin, for instance, was a very prominent anti-Tokugawa thinker of the Bakumatsu period. One of the main villains, the guy who actually beats up Himura, towards the end of the initial story arc, is clearly identified as the chief of secret police for the Tokugawa. Okay, so the point I'm making is that the events we see here are very clearly grounded in actual history, right? Things that really did happen. But where things get kind of interesting is that ultimately Himura's character arc, having been an extremely effective assassin for the Choshu domain, involves him awakening to the futility of killing and basically renouncing killing as a way of atoning for all of the people he did actually murder. The story goes on into the Meiji period, which is 1867 to 1912. But perhaps the most stark or striking symbol of this renunciation of killing is the iconic weapon, the sakabato, the reverse bladed katana here. It's not perhaps easy to see initially, but the edge of this particular katana is actually turned inwards, meaning the striking edge is actually blunt, which makes it almost impossible to actually kill anybody with it. And this becomes essentially a symbol of Himura's repentance, his determination to embrace pacifism and basically never to kill anybody ever again. Now, as somebody who works on the culture of 19th and 20th century Japan, as it did actually happen, this seems somewhat jarring, not least because pacifism is emphatically not what became a major leitmotif of the Meiji period. In fact, we saw Japan's extension as a colonial power throughout this period, 2 major wars, and eventually the colonization of the Korean peninsula, which was particularly brutal and oppressive. What's particularly interesting is that the idea of pacifistic awakening seems like it fits much better with the post-1945 Japan, the post-war period here, right? The post-war constitution, for instance, as some of you may know, forbade both the waging of war and the maintenance of armed forces here. In other words, it sort of looks as if Himura's transformation comes 100 years too early, right? It's placed at the beginning of the Meiji period, Japan's entry into modernity. And in some sense, you could argue it's a form of rewriting history. It's basically arguing that this pacifistic identity for Japan was always there at the beginning of modernity, even though it actually wasn't. Now, there are various ways in which we can read this. The one I would choose to read, perhaps, is aspirational. In other words, it's a vision of what the samurai could and perhaps should have been, rather than what actually happened. The reality, of course, was that the image of the historical samurai was reinvented in the early 20th century, particularly under the label of Bushido, and then used as a form of justification for various forms of shocking atrocities and hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. The point I would make, though, is that with Rurouni Kenshin, and particularly Himura's reversed sword, what we see is a vision of Japanese history as it should have been, right, while also being grounded in what actually was. And I'd like you to sort of bear that in mind as a kind of our first case study, because our second case study is in some ways quite similar. I'm looking at the legendary ninja Hattori Hanzo. How many of you have heard Hattori Hanzo? Yeah, I mean, I know if you're in my ninja course, you definitely have, because we've been talking about him all the time. But I mean, we have, for instance, the swordsmith Hattori Hanzo in Tarantino's Kill Bill, actually played by the legendary Sonny Chiba, who tragically passed away just a couple of months ago, I think. He was with us till comparatively recent. I'm showing my age here because this is a 1992 Sega Genesis game called Shining Force, which features a ninja called Hanzo. Overwatch perhaps is a little bit more up to date on this point. Ninja Hattori-kun, Hattori the Little Ninja, is a sort of another particular character. This is Samurai Warriors as well. Hattori Hanzo is a character in that particular game as well. Point is, Hattori Hanzo, or Double H, as I like to call him, is basically everywhere, right? He's a very prominent character in video games, anime, manga, and just about everywhere in between here, okay? So it would be natural to assume, given that Hattori Hanzo is probably the single best known ninja of all time and seemingly everywhere, that he has been known as a master ninja across the whole of Japanese history, and that there is a ton of solid historical evidence attesting to his existence and what he did, right? Seems a natural assumption. Actually, no. Just about the only solid evidence that we have with regards to the historical Hattori Hanzo is that he did exist, was a high-ranking retainer of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first shogun of the Tokugawa period. And that's kind of it. We don't really know that much else about him here. So the question arises, where does all of this lore about Hattori Hanzo as a ninja actually come from? Well, there's a couple of interesting points here. One is that there is a boom in the early 20th century, the 1910s and 1920s, in what I would call ninja-like fiction, featuring heroes who are called things like Kirigakure Saizo and Sarutobi Sasuke. These guys become really major figures. They later claimed as ninja, even though I would argue they weren't at the time. But one of the interesting things is that Hattori Hanzo isn't there. He doesn't show up until the 1950s in the capacity as a ninja. And by the way, just for fans of Naruto, these particular elements, these early 20th century ninja heroes, show up in Naruto as well. The Kirigakure village is named after Kirigakure Saizo. Sarutobi Sasuke gives his name, I think, to an entire clan in Naruto, if I'm not mistaken here. It's also, so the point I'm basically getting at here is that the image of Hattori Hanzo as a ninja, we owe a great deal to manga, okay? And I'd like to just look at some very basic examples here of Hattori Hanzo as depicted in Shirato Sanpei's manga from the late 1950s and early to mid 1960s. This is from Ninja Senpu, Ninja Tornado, essentially, which weirdly enough, if you translate it into Chinese, is also the title for Lego Ninjago Spinjitzu, although I don't think the two are actually connected. And also in a further anime here by Sasuke. So we see here Hattori Hanzo appearing out of nowhere. If you can read Japanese, you'll know, but basically he's fooled somebody into thinking he's dead with like a shadow image of him, and now he actually shows up. Here, he's using ninja magic. He's actually breathing fire, right? I mean, as we all know, ninja could use magic and do all kinds of cool stuff here, right? What's interesting here is that this is the first, I think, or one of the very first attestations of Hanzo as actually a practicing ninja, right? Rather than as a samurai. This is the first time we've really seen him. Up to this point, he's generally been depicted as a samurai, just straight up as he actually was. We see him in a variety of other forms, particularly in Shirato Sanpei's manga over the years. He's here hanging upside down from a tree, basically using sort of shadow magic as a way of displacing himself, as a way of hiding from somebody. And I like, by the way, if you can read Japanese, it's ha 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 ha, which I translated as bua ha 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 ha, because that sort of feels about right for a ninja using magic to disappear here. Later on, by the way, he actually acquires an identity as a ninja master, right? Rather than just as a rank and file ninja, he actually appears as the head of particular ninja organizations. Here, by the way, he's being challenged by the head of a rival ninja clan to go and do battle here. And this, by the way, this is actually somewhat later in 1969. Now, the basic point that I want to make here is that virtually all of this idea of Hattori Hanzo as having been a ninja comes from popular culture, right? From novels, and in this case, particularly from manga here. I'm not sure that everybody necessarily realizes this, but I think it's actually a great example of the way in which popular cultural memory, manga, and anime can kind of all blend together, especially in cases like with Hattori Hanzo, where we know almost nothing about the actual historical figure. Things kind of come in to fill the gap, as we might put it. Not everybody realizes this. As I've said, you will actually find books that are attempting to track down the real historical ninja Hattori Hanzo. These are usually quite slim books, basically because this is probably not really possible. To kind of put this in context and explain what this is kind of like. So imagine the film Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Any of you seen it? No? Yeah? Okay. Now imagine for a moment that Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter is your only source of information about Abraham Lincoln. And you go looking through graveyards in Illinois for axe marks that might have been made by Lincoln. You're not going to find any. And this is basically the same thing that is going on with Hattori Hanzo here. It's really quite a remarkable case of history and fiction kind of blurring together here, and sometimes interchanging. It's something perhaps we don't think is necessarily happening in historical settings, but I would argue it definitely does here. Okay, so this is basically my take-home point here, right? So warrior manga and anime that use historical settings, frequently they don't just reflect history, but they can actively work to shape it, or certainly at least the cultural memory thereof, how it's understood on a popular level. And we need to pay attention to this aspect of manga and anime if we do serious historical work, but also with these iconic cultural figures of samurai, ninja, and geisha. And if you do take my courses next semester, this is a big part of what we are likely to be doing. Just as a reminder, fall 2022, samurai and geisha, and the art of the ninja. Thank you. Oh, I'm not, sorry.
Thank you very much. And our final presenter is Professor Judith Crew, also of the School of International Letters and Cultures. Professor Crew is an assistant professor of Modern Japanese Linguistics and Comparative Cultural Studies. And I will turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Where are we in the class? Oh, she's have to do. Good. Oh, yeah, go for it. Okay. Can the people online see and hear? Yes? Okay, no, that's fine. I can keep on this one. Can you turn? Good. Okay, so everyone can see and hear online, I hope so. Awesome. Okay, so my name is Judith Crew, and as Professor Hedberg mentioned, I actually don't work on literature directly. The kind of work that I do looks at how people make sense of the world through language and through their practices. So one field that I'm closely aligned with would be linguistic anthropology. I mention this because the way in which I read manga and anime is slightly different, because I'm interested more in what it can tell us about how we live. What are the possibilities for life? We tend to think of popular culture as very removed from the other aspects of our life. It's a kind of place that we return to when we're feeling stressed. We watch some anime, maybe we read a manga. But I want to show you how thinking through what certain anime do, particularly in this case, with respect to the representation of young women, can tell us about the possibilities for living full stop. What the social structures that young Japanese individuals struggle with, manage, and contend, and what that can tell us about the way in which we also move through the world. And I want to do this by thinking through this concept of shoujo. Have all of you heard this term shoujo before? Yeah? So literally shoujo means adolescent girl. So it's formed from two characters, one the character for small and the other the character for girl. But less literally, which is to say not in a direct translation, but more in its pragmatics, in its usage, it tends to refer to schoolgirls. And the idea of shoujo in Japan is it has a very strong kind of cultural history and social memory. As Tsuchiya Dolase noted, shoujo may be physically mature and recognized as capable of reproduction, which is to say the category of shoujo covers quite a large age range, including people who are not like pre-adolescent, right? Actually, adolescent women, young women in university even, kind of at the borderline, but, and this is the crucial point, they are temporarily partitioned in this space of school, which is to say, as long as they are in school, they are not part of the normal social world. In the same way that when you're here at ASU, right, there's like possibilities for self-expression that you may not have once you graduate and have to join the workforce, right? Notice some of you have really amazingly colored hair, right? I have a friend who went through this ritual passage when they were graduating university. They had the most awesome, like super pink, bright hair, but they decided to work as an investment banker. And on a very particular day, I had to go over to their dorm room and we ritually dyed their hair black. And they were crying, right? And for them, this was a mark of a kind of rite of passage, a turning into the normal social world. But in school, they were free to experiment with sense of themselves that they couldn't in other spaces. So as Tsuchiya Dolase notes, as long as they are in this space, they are free from social obligations, including marriage. And what I want to do today is explore what the possibilities are of this space, this kind of liminal, which is to say in-between space, that many of you actually occupy now. What are the social possibilities there? What are the kind of political possibilities that exist there? Do I click this? Yes. Okay, to give you a brief history of shoujo, we tend to think of the construction of this life stage as linked to reforms in the education code, particularly the 1987 education reform that led to the rapid establishment of many girls' schools. Prior to that period, and actually kind of not leading into, but tying into Professor Tuck's talk, the Meiji Restoration created a huge range of social changes. And one of those was the ability of young women to go to school. Now, of course, this schoolgirl category was classed because women who came from lower socioeconomic category families were not able to really attend school. Like it cost money and things like this. But suddenly you had this new category, this visible category of young girls wearing very particular clothes, going to school together. And thus was born not just a social category that became a site of projection of all kinds of insecurities and senses of unease about what it meant to be a modern Japan, but also just legit a physical category because there were these young girls who were going to school. This social category spread further in 1899 girls' high school law, which mandated that each prefecture had to have a certain number of high schools. I mean, proportionate to their population. Now, the education law didn't actually forbid co-education, but in practice, what ended up happening was you had the establishment of a lot of girls-only high schools, which created a space that was not only gendered in a certain way, but also exclusively gendered, because young women were not going to school with young men. They were going to spaces that were, in a sense, girls only, creating a culture that was for girls and by girls. And one of the products of this kind of cultural category were girls' magazines, which proliferated in the 1910s. So I have some images, some examples of these girls' magazines. And what these girls' magazines consisted of were stories, many of which were translations from English. So for example, Little Women was serialized, Anne of Green Gables, the kind of girls' fiction that you might associate with your childhood. A lot of it was being read by early 1900s peers in Japan, as well as letters. So there was this active culture of young women writing in to these magazines, and they were talking about their emotional lives and their friendships. Another kind of genre of fiction that proliferated in these magazines were girls' friendship stories, which were intense and very romantic stories of female love that did not have a sexual component, right? So it was romantic love without sexuality. At the same time, and this is where the interesting tension arises, these magazines were also used to promote what we call the ryosai kenbo, which is good wife, wise mother ideals. So you can see that there's a tension there between, on the one hand, a kind of what you might say queering of space, where young women are experimenting with new forms of emotional attachment, new senses of identities on the one hand, and on the other hand, a kind of attempt to control the space, where young women are being instructed into what counts as desirable femininity. So this kind of possibility for queering has been explored a lot by people who are in literature, but also people who are outside of literature. So for anthropologist Jennifer Robertson, shoujo means not quite female. So she takes the kind of literal definition of shoujo, which is young woman, and argues that what it really means is that you are a woman who is not quite a woman yet, a person who is not quite fully entered into what it means to be feminine. And she argues that there's a lot of potential political power in that, because, and in as much as the shoujo category implies heterosexual inexperience, there's also a form of homosexual experience, which is to say these intense female friendships that are not focused on sexuality as a physical act, but are focused on a kind of overflowing of romantic love. And so taking this one step further, there is a sense that shoujo thus constitute their own gender, which is neither male nor female, and that is very importantly detached from productive economies. So when we think about productive economy in a gendered sense, and we link it back to what it means to be ryosai kenpo, right? Good wife, wise mother. There's a lot of things that are implied there. If you are a good wife and a wise mother, you have to be married, right? And that means that you have to thus provide for, in a sort of physical labor sense, a home. You also are a wise mother, which means you have to have produced children. But shoujo do not produce anything. They are not married. They have not productively engaged in homemaking, and they also don't have children. So they are literally not producing the nation. What they are doing, though, is they're consuming things. They're consuming stories. They might even be consuming products, because shoujo as a category is not just a category that's a life stage, it's also a market, a very particular market, a market towards which so many Japanese advertisers target their products. These are young individuals who can fully consume, but they don't produce anything, right? They are not fully entered into the economic sphere. They're not adults, so they're not working full time. They're not married, so they don't have to produce children. They're not producing money. They're not producing people, as it were. What they are doing is they are incorporating things and thinking about things and exploring a sense of identity based on consumption. So what Jennifer Robertson argues is that they are consummate consumers. So why does this matter? Well, Japan is a nation that is currently in a state of significant social change. Some of the aspects of this social change include a rapid decline in the population. I'm not talking about birth rate. We're at the point where there are literally every year fewer Japanese people than there were the year before. So this is like absolute population decline. By some estimates, the population of Japan will decline by 20-something% by 2050. Can you imagine? What that looks like is like 1 out of every 5 of you gone. Suddenly, well, not gone suddenly, this isn't the leftovers, but you know, it's a very significant existential crisis. And this has led to a whole series of popular, I guess you could say, social science work that looks at Japan as a nation in disappearance. And how do we think about a nation where the population is literally going down? At the same time, for many younger Japanese people, there is the sense that the nation has always been in a state of economic decline. What that means is that after the asset bubble, there was a huge asset bubble in Japan in the late 1980s. And when that burst in 1989, what that looked like was the prices of houses and wages and things, everything got cheaper. So for most of your Japanese peers, in their entire life, the value of a house has always been slightly less every year than the year before. It's kind of like exactly the reverse phenomenon as to what's going on in Phoenix right now, right? It's not an explosion, it's like a gradual decline. At the same time, you know, the countryside is slowly declining in terms of its population. You have, I'm sure many of you have learned about these empty towns and school closures and so on, right? So for this anthropologist, Otsuka Eiji, he wants to think about what it means to be Japanese today under these conditions. So he argues that the Japanese are no longer producers, right? And he's looking at it in terms of, we are not producing more Japanese people. And similarly, you know, there's significant wage deflation and there is significant asset deflation. Rather, he argues, our existence consists solely of the distribution and consumption of things brought to us from elsewhere, things with which we play. Nor are these things actually tangible, but are instead only signs without any direct utility in life. What name are we to give this life of ours? This name is shoujo. So what he's arguing is that in fact, this very specific cultural phenomenon can actually be a way to understand what it means to be Japanese today. So he's abstracting, like looking out over the broad social field and saying, this is what it means to be Japanese today. We are an entire nation of effectively this young women category. This is not new. The idea that young women's bodies become symbolic of the nation, and so young women's bodies are where we think about all of the anxieties that we have about our role in the world, that's not restricted to Japan. When we think about, for example, the way in which vocal fry, do you guys all know what vocal fry is? Vocal fry is, it's a linguistic phenomenon. It can be best described as how Kim Kardashian speaks. So if I talk like this, this is called vocal fry, right? So who do we associate vocal fry with? Do we associate it with men or women, generally? What? Women, yes. Yes, young women, right? And when we talk about vocal fry, we use it typically critically. So we say, oh, they're so young women. All those degenerate young women. They don't know how to speak correctly. They're so louche. They're so, they're not behaving like proper women. And let me tell you, this is what is the trouble with the world today. So we take this one category of young women, and by the way, young men use vocal fry more than young women, except when young men vocal fry, it doesn't register for the interlocutor. When young women do it, people hear it. When young men do it, they don't hear it. This is a legit linguistic fact. But we then abstract over this category of young women, and we say, oh, look, let me tell you about society today. A couple of years ago, there was an app, a photography app, and people created an entire category around this photography app that they claimed was used by young women. Pumpkin lattes, pumpkin spice lattes are linked to being basic. Can you be a basic dude? I'm not sure, but you can definitely be basic if you're a young woman, and it's linked to socioeconomic status. And then it becomes this whole big argument about, I don't know, degeneracy, right? Now, at the same time that young women's bodies become symbolic of the nation and become a way to critique both young women and the nation at large, the marginal voice that young women occupy can also be a tactic, because as you inhabit this liminal space as a young woman, you are free to point out social wrong. You are free to think about what society looks like because you are not a stakeholder in a certain way, right? You are not a producer, you are a consumer. Your choice is to consume X versus Y. You are able to be kind of separate from society, and that marginalization has some kind of power associated with it. So I want to now take an example of one anime and think about how this one anime that is very central to social culture can be a way to kind of begin to think through some social, ecological, and economic changes in Japan. And at the same time, I want to demonstrate that these political potentials always have limitations, because the relationship to gendered roles is complex. It's never straightforward, right? And I want to look at Fruits Basket. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it, or read it. It's one of Japan's top-selling manga, and the manga itself ran from 1998 to 2006, and it spawned 2 anime series, one in 2001 and one much later in 2019. And there's actually a new anime series that's scheduled for 2022. So Fruits Basket is very much what we would call a reverse harem type anime or manga, the genre. So a reverse harem is where you have a harem, but in reverse. You have a young woman who typically is, due to some circumstances, ends up living in a house with a bunch of cute boys. So here, the young woman is Toru Handa. She's an orphan, and she's briefly homeless, and she meets the Soma family. She was living in a tent, and there was a storm, and then they found her, and they let her live in their house, and moves in with them. Right, so this is the reverse harem trope. She learns that 12 members of the Soma family are actually possessed by the animals of the Chinese zodiac and are cursed to turn into their animal forms whenever they are weak or stressed, or whenever they are embraced by anyone of the opposite sex. Actually, it should be really opposite gender, but they treat sex and gender pretty interchangeably in the anime. So Toru learns of the hardships and the pain faced by these members, and she learns to kind of both care for them and care for herself. So there's a way in which there's a kind of precarity, precarity is a term that refers to risk or social, particularly social forms of risk, that is queered in this anime. So on the one hand, you have Toru, who's like homeless. She has been thrown out of her normative family structure. However, she's able to find an alternative family, a non-biological family, with the Soma family. She, however, is required to take on all the housework. And so here you begin to see that there is a tension between what it means to be part of an alternative family, a particularly queer one at that, and a set of normative expectations of what it means to be the heroine of an anime, right? There is a kind of economic value that's accorded to her work. So she literally works in order to live in a house. Her work thus becomes visible, which again creates a kind of tension between on the one hand, this adherence to Ryosai Kembo, which is the good wife, mother. She is now, productively helping to take care of the house. But in the other hand, when we tend to talk about the kind of labor that's done in housework, we tend to talk about how it's like elided, which is to say it's rendered invisible. You don't typically say, this is a thing that has been raised in many feminist studies, women who do housework are not legit paid for it, right? So here, though, she does receive a very practical benefit, which is housing and food, and the ability to continue to go to school and have a normal life. There's also a sense in Fruits Basket of a set of complex gendered roles. So Toru is rejected by her biological family, and she finds a new form of family, a new alternative family with the Somas. And this alternative family emphasizes care. But this care goes kind of both ways. On the one hand, she cares for the family. They then in turn care for her. And there's kind of a sense of negotiation of boundaries here, because the nurturing both undermines and reinforces traditional gendered roles. It undermines traditional gendered roles because all of these characters that she is interacting with treat her in ways that don't quite accord to the sort of mother or girlfriend or friend. There's a lot of boundary crossing there. So it undermines those roles, but at the same time, it reinforces them because, again, she's doing housework to be able to live in this, with this family. There's another sense in which Fruits Basket negotiates a kind of queered relationship, and that's through its representation of what you might consider post-human relationships. And this is because the line between human and non-human is frequently crossed, and these crossings correspond to moments of romantic desire. I mean, anytime you hug, for example, the boy character that she quite fancies is this guy called Kyo, and every time she hugs him, he turns into an orange cat. Right? So these crossings of the human and the post-human correspond to these moments of romantic desire. And thus romantic desire itself is kind of made different. It begins to fall out slightly of these kind of ordinary categories of heterosexual relationships. But again, it's a give and take, right? Again, it doesn't quite go one way or the other because at the same time, these queered relationships correspond to normative gender roles. So kind of looking at the entirety of Fruits Basket, what you might see is that there's an economy of relationships and care and family. But this economy is not productive. It's an economy of playful nurture, playful romance. It can never really get anywhere because anytime you hug them, they turn into a cat, right? There's no production that's possible in this model. That this economy can exist at all is due to the character's separation from normative social structures. They're magical, right? In the same way that she is removed from normal social structure, she's removed from her family. She's homeless, and she's also a schoolgirl. And what I would say is that it thus offers a new perspective on these social structures. So I guess the point that I want to make is that Japanese culture, pop culture, helps us to understand and interpret not only Japan, but also the structure of our own world. Because as we begin to see these slightly queered, but also normative relationships, as we begin to think about what certain spaces allow us to do and what they limit us from doing, we begin to understand our own world and the possibilities of our own world better. And if you're interested in learning more, the SLC 421, which is Japanese Literature and Translation, there's tons and tons of different topics that we offer. Some of them do actually deal with things like economic precarity. Some of you are in my class right now, which is SLC 421, and it's about disaster, which is great. I mean, not great in the sense of like, yay, disaster, but I think we're all having fun. And there is a class that I will be offering in the future on gender, sexuality, and power in Japanese culture, which if you're interested in these questions, hopefully will be interesting to you as well. And that's it. Thank you.